The marriage bed is a place of truth, yet I entered it wrapped in a shroud of lies. To the world I was a lady of standing, fulfilling a contract penned in ink before I was even born. To the Duke of Ashbourne I was a phantom, a substitute bride standing in the shadows of my cousin's golden reputation. They say a duke's honor is his life, but what happens when that honor is built upon a deception? This is a story of a silent heart that dared to speak, a rigid man who forgot how to feel, and the one secret that threatened to burn an entire legacy to ash. If you find yourself captivated by this tale of stolen identities and Regency scandal, please subscribe and like the video. I would love to hear in the comments what is your favorite historical romance trope, or which period drama world do you wish you could live in? Chapter 1. The Weight of the Veil. The rain in Derbyshire did not fall, it wept. It streaked against the leaded glass of the carriage windows, blurring the rolling greens of the Ashbourne estate into a smear of grey and charcoal. Inside the cabin, Amelia sat so still she might have been carved from the very marble that adorned the Duke's foyer. Her hands, encased in delicate lace gloves that didn't belong to her, trembled in her lap. She looked down at the gold band on her finger. It was too heavy. It felt like a shackle rather than a promise. "You must breathe, Amelia," she whispered to herself, the sound swallowed by the rhythmic clatter of horseshoes against the cobblestone. "If you do not breathe, you will faint, and if you faint, he will lift the veil before we reach the manor." The deception had been born of desperation, a frantic plan hatched in the dim light of a sick room. Her cousin, Clara, the beautiful, the radiant, the promised, had fallen to the scarlet fever only 3 days before the wedding. The Duke of Ashbourne, a man known more for his cold adherence to duty than for any lick of passion, would not have waited for a recovery. The contract was clear. The marriage must occur by the spring equinox to secure the lands and the lineage. If the wedding failed, Clara's family farm would be seized and her elderly parents cast into the workhouse. So the invisible cousin had been summoned. Amelia, who had spent her life in the corners of ballrooms, fixing Clara's hems and softening her shadows, was thrust into the white silk. The carriage groaned to a halt. The door was wrenched open by a footman in stiff livery, and there he stood, Silas, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper silences. His coat was a deep navy, nearly black, and his cravat was tied with a precision that bordered on the aggressive. He did not offer a smile, he offered a gloved hand. Amelia took it, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As she stepped down, the wind caught her veil, momentarily pressing the fine mesh against her face. Through the white haze, she saw his eyes, dark, perceptive, and chillingly distant. "Welcome to your new home, Your Grace," he said. His voice was a rich baritone, smooth as aged brandy, but just as intoxicating. "Thank you, my lord," she managed to murmur, pitching her voice low, hoping the wind would disguise the tremor. They walked into the great hall of Ashbourne, a cathedral of stone and ancestral pride. Silas did not linger for pleasantries. He led her toward the grand staircase, his strides long and purposeful. Amelia hurried to keep pace, the heavy skirts of her gown feeling like a leaden weight. "The journey was long," Silas remarked, his back to her. "I have instructed the staff to prepare your rooms. We shall dine at 8. I trust that provides ample time for you to settle." He paused at the landing, turning slightly. The light from a nearby candelabra caught the high ridge of his cheekbone. You have been remarkably quiet since the ceremony, Clara. Your father's letters led me to believe you were a woman of spirited conversation. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. She bowed her head, the lace of the veil obscuring her features. The fever, the illness took much of my energy, my lord. I find I am not quite myself today. Silas studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. Amelia held her breath, certain he would reach out, tear away the lace, and demand to know who this impostor was. Instead, he gave a curt nod. "Restore yourself, then. I have waited 5 years to fulfill this contract. I can wait a few more hours for a conversation." He turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. Amelia watched him go, her hand clutching the banister. She was a duchess now. She had saved her family, but as she looked at the towering portraits of the Ashbourne women lining the hall, she felt like a thief in a temple. She was a ghost inhabiting a living woman's life, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the Duke was not a man who took kindly to being haunted. The shadows of Ashbourne Manor grew long and predatory as night fell, casting flickering shapes across the velvet wallpaper of the dining hall. Amelia sat at one end of a table long enough to host a parliament, the distance between her and Silas feeling like a vast, uncrossable ocean. Every clink of her silver fork against the fine bone china sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She had exchanged her wedding finery for a gown of deepest midnight blue, one of Clara's trousseau pieces that hung slightly loose on her smaller frame. She had styled her hair in the intricate coils Clara favoured, but without her cousin's golden sheen, Amelia felt like a pale imitation, a sketch of a masterpiece. Chapter 2. The Cracks in the Mask. Silas sat at the head of the table, the candlelight illuminating the stern set of his jaw. He had not touched his wine. His dark eyes remained fixed on Amelia, observing her with a clinical intensity that made her skin prickle. "You eat like a bird, Clara," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I recall your father mentioning your fondness for the hunt and a robust appetite to match. Has the Derbyshire air dampened your spirits so quickly?" Amelia took a slow, measured sip of water to steady her voice. "I find that my recent indisposition has left me with little taste for heavy meats, my lord. I am told that recovery requires patience." "Patience," Silas repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a hint of irony. "A virtue I have had to cultivate in abundance. 5 years of correspondence, of waiting for our family's lands to be joined. I had begun to think you were a myth, a creature of ink and paper." He leaned forward, the golden light catching the silver in his signet ring. "And now that you are here, you are as quiet as a mouse. Where is the woman who wrote to me of her love for the poetry of Byron and her disdain for the rigidities of the ton?" Amelia felt a cold sweat break across her nape. Clara had never read Byron in her life. She had paid Amelia, the bookish cousin, to ghost-write those letters to impress the intellectual Duke. Every word Silas had fallen in love with had been hers, but the face he expected to see was not. "Perhaps," Amelia whispered, looking down at her plate, "the woman you imagined is different from the woman who stands before you. Letters can be a mask, can they not?" Silas's gaze narrowed. "A mask or a mirror? I prefer to think they reveal the soul. But you look different than the miniature your father sent last year. I attribute it to the paleness of your illness, but there is a gravity in your eyes I do not recognize." "Time changes us all," she replied, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her corset. The tension was broken by the entrance of the butler, a silver-haired man named Hedges, carrying a small tray. "Pardon the intrusion, Your Grace, but this arrived by express rider from your father-in-law. He was adamant it be delivered to you directly this evening."
Amelia's breath hitched. A letter? Or worse, something her uncle had forgotten to include in the dowry. Silas took the small rectangular package from the tray. "You may go, Hedges." With a flick of a silver letter opener, Silas broke the wax seal. Amelia watched, paralyzed, as he pulled out a small, velvet-lined case. Her stomach dropped. She knew exactly what it was. It was the new miniature portrait Clara had sat for just a month ago, intended to be a wedding gift, but delayed by the artist. Silas flipped the lid open. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the crackle of the logs in the hearth. Amelia saw the muscle in Silas's jaw twitch. He looked at the portrait, the golden-haired, blue-eyed, exuberant Clara, and then he looked up at the dark-haired, grey-eyed woman sitting at his table. He didn't scream. He didn't erupt in rage. He simply grew cold, a frost that seemed to emanate from his very bones. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Amelia stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "My lord, I can explain. I asked you a question," Silas roared, slamming the miniature onto the mahogany table. The glass cracked. "This woman in the portrait is the woman I married by proxy. This is the woman whose name is on the contract. You are a stranger in my house. You are a trespasser in my name. I am Amelia," she cried out, the truth finally bursting forth like blood from a wound. "Clara's cousin. She was dying, my lord. The fever. It would have ruined everything. Your lands, the contract, my family's survival. I did it to save them." Silas surged to his feet, rounding the table with predatory grace. He stopped inches from her, his breath warm on her face, but his eyes like ice. "You deceived me at the altar. You allowed me to place the Ashbourne ring on the finger of a liar. Do you have any idea what the law does to women like you?" "I know what poverty does to families like mine," Amelia countered, her fear turning into a desperate sort of courage. "I have lived in the shadows of that perfect bride my whole life. I wrote those letters you loved, not her. Every thought, every poem, every word that made you want this marriage came from me." Silas flinched as if struck. His hand reached out, grabbing her upper arm, not with violence, but with a crushing, trembling grip. You wrote those letters?" "Yes," she sobbed. "She didn't care for your mind, Silas. She only cared for your title. I was the one who knew you." He let go of her as if burned, his face a mask of horror and confusion. "I have married a ghost, a fraud." He turned away, his voice thick with loathing. "Get out of my sight. I cannot look at you without seeing the mockery you've made of my honor. I shall send for the solicitors in the morning. This farce will be annulled." Amelia didn't wait. She turned and fled the room, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. She ran past the startled servants, out through the heavy oak doors, and into the black, rain-soaked night. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that the walls of Ashbourne were closing in, and the man she had loved through ink and paper now looked at her as if she were a monster. The rain had turned the Derbyshire hills into a treacherous labyrinth of mud and mist. Amelia ran until her lungs burned like banked coals, her thin slippers shredded by the jagged stones of the carriage path. Behind her, the lights of Ashbourne Manor flickered like dying stars. She felt a hollow sort of freedom. The lie was dead, but she was now a woman without a name, a ghost wandering the moors. Chapter 3. The Truth in the Ruins.
Silas stood in the middle of the dining hall, the shattered miniature of Clara mocking him from the floor. He should have been triumphant in his fury. He was a man of logic, and the logic was simple. He had been swindled. Yet, as he looked at the shards of glass, he realized he felt no grief for the woman in the painting. He felt a searing, agonizing loss for the woman who had just fled. He moved to his desk and pulled out the bundle of letters he had kept tied in silk. He opened one at random, reading the elegant, slanted script. "I find that the soul is not a thing to be bartered, but a flame to be tended." He remembered reading that line and feeling, for the first time in his life, that someone truly saw the man beneath the ducal crest. He looked at the portrait of Clara, beautiful, vacant, and utterly foreign. Then he thought of Amelia's eyes, the way they had sparkled with hidden intelligence even as she trembled. "The letters," he whispered to the empty room. "The letters were the truth, the face was the lie." He didn't call for a carriage, he didn't wait for his coat. Silas flung open the manor doors and charged into the storm. He found her nearly 2 miles away, huddled beneath the crumbling stone arch of an old Roman bridge. She was shivering violently, her midnight blue dress soaked black, her hair clinging to her pale cheeks. She looked small, broken, and entirely magnificent. "Amelia!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. She recoiled, her eyes wide with terror. "Go away. Send your solicitors. Call the guards, but do not mock me further." Silas didn't stop until he was standing in the mud before her. He dropped to his knees, heedless of his dignity or his fine wool trousers. "I went back to the letters," he panted, his voice raw. "I read them again. Every word about the poetry, the stars, the fear of being lonely in a crowded room, that was you." "It was always me," she sobbed, pressing her back against the cold stone. "But I am not the Duchess you were promised." "No," Silas said, reaching out to cup her face with trembling hands. "You are the woman I fell in love with over 5 years of ink and longing. I was a fool, Amelia. I was so blinded by the contract and the honor of the name that I didn't see that the woman in front of me was the only one who actually knew my heart." "You will be the laughing-stock of the ton," she whispered, though she didn't pull away from his touch. "A duke who married a penniless cousin by mistake." "Let them laugh," Silas growled, his forehead dropping to hers. "Let them whisper until their throats are dry. I would rather spend a lifetime defending a fraud who loves me than a day with a proper bride who does not know the first thing about my soul. I am not annulling this marriage, Amelia. I am claiming it." He kissed her then, a desperate, salty kiss that tasted of rain and redemption. In that moment, the rigid Duke of Ashbourne broke, and the man Silas emerged. They returned to Ashbourne not as a master and a trespasser, but as a husband and wife forged in the heat of a shared truth. Silas did not hide her. He sat her at his right hand and burned the miniature of Clara in the hearth, watching the gold leaf curl and blacken. Amelia was no longer the invisible cousin. She was the Duchess who spoke her mind, the woman who turned a cold mausoleum into a home. They learned that honor isn't found in a legal contract or a perfect lineage, but in the courage to be seen for exactly who you are. The world eventually stopped whispering, silenced by the undeniable force of a love that had started with a lie but ended with the purest kind of truth.